My name is Richard Doughty, and I was born in Greeneville on September the 28th, 1923. Our family has lived in Greeneville since about 1780, and I just recently filled out 5 forms on First Families of Tennessee. One was on Major John Harmon, who was in the Revolution. Another was John Guess, who was also in the Revolution. The third was John Carter in the Revolution. Another one was Joshua Kidwell in the Revolution. And then my Doughty ancestor, Benjamin Doughty, brought his family from Upper Virginia in the Potomac Valley and settled in Cobb County about the 1790s. And the Doughty branch of the family started over there and then moved down into Monroe and Roane and Loudoun counties, and eventually, after the Civil War, came to Greeneville. The earliest recollections that I have are of older people, because my father was 47 when I was born, my mother was 40, and I grew up in an atmosphere which was more or less dominated by people in middle age or even older age, and as a result I've always been interested in things that many people my age would not have been interested in: antiques and preservation of old buildings, houses and so forth, genealogy, and a great many things that a lot of younger people simply just didn't turn them on. I went to a private kindergarten conducted by Mrs. Molly Humphreys. She was Molly Mitchell, and she was a relative of ours through the Kidwell side of the family. I stayed with her for 2.5 years, and when I entered public school, I was 7. I could read and write and do simple problems in arithmetic. I started in the 2nd grade at Roby Fitzgerald School, and Miss Roby was very much in command there. And we held Miss Roby in great awe. I don't think we were afraid of her, but still we had a great deal of respect for her, and she was a person who really commanded respect. I stayed at the Roby in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. My first teacher was Miss Verna Hutton. She quit in the middle of the year to marry Dale Alexander, who was a noted baseball player. And then the year was filled out by Mrs. Anna Mary Anderson Boone. The 3rd grade, I had Mrs. Lucille Tilson, and she introduced me to a great many things. One of them was pink lemonade. We did a unit on the circus, and when we ended the unit, we had this sandbox with animals and clowns and things all through it, and she brought pink lemonade from home and served to us, and that was my first introduction to that. We did a lot of study about foreign countries. We did a unit on the Netherlands or Holland. We did a unit on Italy. We did a unit on France, and that gave me a love of studying about foreign countries, and also introduced me to my love of travel. My 4th grade teacher was Merle Reeves' niece, and I remember that we did a play that year called, it was taken from Sunny of Sunnyside, but we adapted it, and it was known as Reddy's Mammoth Show. And I had the role of Hank in it, and I remember I sang a solo. That was my first introduction to the stage. And I remember singing this song: "The bookworm deserves imitation, for he just dotes on education, with history for dinner, adventure for lunch, and sometimes a story to munch," and so forth. But that was my first introduction to the Roby stage, and then I took the part of George Washington in the play over there, which was directed by Mrs. Tilson, and I was one of the 3 wise men in a musical production of The Christmas Story under the direction of Virgil Self. And the years at Roby were very, very happy ones. Of course, they were before the 2nd World War, and we weren't thinking about that. We were simply trying to get through the Depression as best we could. And one thing that always impressed me about the people of Greeneville, nobody had any money, but we seemed to live pretty well. Nobody was starving, and I never remember a time that I was hungry, so evidently things were going pretty well in Greeneville when they weren't going so well in other parts of the country. My 6th grade teacher my 5th grade teacher again was Mrs. Anna Mary Anderson. I had her fill out the 2nd grade and also the 5th. And then the 6th grade teacher was Miss Ethel Gosnell. And a lot of the students didn't care for Miss Ethel, but I just adored her because there was no foolishness to her. She was just as fair as she could be. But she really wanted you to learn. She had a great passion for teaching, and she was quite eager for every one of her students to learn just as much as they could. The years growing up were spent largely on North Main Street. Of course, there was no fear of children being molested or anything of that sort. The whole neighborhood kept a watch, you might say, on the children playing up and down the street. And every summer, my cousin Betsy Bowman would come up from Knoxville, and she was always the ringleader in stirring up amateur plays and parades and things of that sort. And Betsy lived in the house with her grandmother, Mrs. W.W. Harmon, where I now reside. The years were spent very carefully. I remember the first time I ever took a long trip. Of course, in those days, going to Knoxville was just the living in, and going to Cress's 5 and 10 cent store, a trip to Knoxville wouldn't have been complete without that. I had brothers and sisters at the University of Tennessee from as long as I can remember. Jim and Bill were there in the late 20s. Nancy entered in the middle 30s, and then Kid did, and so it seemed like Daddy had somebody in the University of Tennessee for a period of about 30 or 40 years. But anyway, a trip to Knoxville was quite the thing. But my first big trip was taken to the Chicago World's Fair in 1934. Mother and Father and I went with Mrs. Eunice and Mr. Lyle Willis and Barbara Willis, the 6 of us in a small car. We spent the first night in Louisville, Kentucky, and then we went to Chicago and stayed at the Hotel Berkeley, or I suppose it might be pronounced Barclay because it was spelled B-E-R-K-E-L-E-Y. Well, the Chicago World's Fair was just the living end as far as I was concerned, because different countries had established villages there, and I particularly remember the Belgian village, which had this beautiful stone church. Mother took me there, and she bought me a pair of wooden shoes. So I suppose that wooden shoes were indigenous to Belgium as well as to the Netherlands, their next door neighbor. Coming back from Chicago, we came through Cincinnati and visited my Uncle Walter and Aunt Emily Doughty King and their 3 daughters, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Winifred. And that was a great experience because Cincinnati was a big city, and I remember they took me to Coney Island, which was an amusement section, and we toured the Cincinnati Zoo, and just a lot of things that a child, I think I was between 10 and 11 when I was there. It's something you never forget. Well, I entered junior high school, the 7th grade, and it was on the 3rd floor of the old Greeneville High School building. And it was the first time I'd ever had departmental teaching. I remember that on the top floor, in one corner was Mrs. Pat Harrison, who taught geography. And then across the hall was Miss Dorothy Brown, who taught reading, Merle Mitchell, history, Miss Carrie Knipp, English, Eleanor Mismer, who taught health, Helen McDonald, who taught science, Mrs. S.E. Wallen, who taught math, and Virgil Sepp was our music teacher. I was only there the 1 year because the very next year the city school system had purchased the Humphreys Reeves house and had converted it into a junior high, and I finished the 8th grade at the old Reeves home, which is now the Jefferson Mortuary. 8th grade graduation was quite the thing in those days, and I remember that Nancy Coles Brown was the valedictorian and I was the salutatorian. And it was the 100th anniversary, I think, of either the death or the birth. I think it was the death of Horace Mann. And so we honored him, and I gave a talk on the life of Horace Mann, and the whole program was geared to that. And I remember that Jane Brown spoke. She was the 3rd in line. No, I'm sorry, Frances Carter. Jane Brown sang a solo, and Earl Snap Jr. played a trumpet solo, Jupiter Polka. And the title of Jane Brown's solo was, "There Are Fairies at the Bottom of Our Garden." I think if you sing that today, you'd probably be laughed off the stage. I entered high school in the 9th grade, and of course, since we had had departmental work in both the 7th and 8th grades, it was nothing new, but of course in high school you only studied 4 subjects. And I remember that my homeroom teacher was Mrs. Lyle Willis. She was also my English teacher, and she was a great teacher and a great lady, and she gave us so much that didn't come out of a textbook. She taught us manners, and she taught us niceties of life, and that's something I think that many children, maybe if they don't learn at home, they should learn at school, and Miss Eunice certainly was good at that. And my math teacher was Mrs. Dale Arnold Susong, who taught algebra. My science teacher was Mabel Mills White, who taught general science. And then my Latin teacher was Miss Frankie Simpson. Well, I carried on with those subjects, and in the junior and senior year, I had Miss Ruth Alexander for history, I had Miss Guy Bryford for English, and they of course made a great, they were a great influence on my life. And then in the senior year, Miss Ruth Harrell took Miss Lucy's place, Lucy Braggs' place, because she was transferred to the junior high, so I had senior English under Miss Harrell, who was also a great influence. I credit Merle Mitchell with my love of history. She would take me on field trips when we were in the 7th and 8th grades. We would go up on top of the hill facing Depot Street and explore the Confederate trenches and find mini balls and things of that sort from the war, and it just made me appreciate history, and particularly a love of local history. When I started college, which was in the fall of '41, I started at Tusculum College, where quite a few of our family had gone. My grandfather was a trustee of Tusculum, but even long before that, my 3 great-grandfathers on mother's side, John Gass, was a trustee of Greenville College when Hezekiah Balch was still the president. Balch died in 1810, so you could see that John Guest would be there before that. He was also Greene County's first representative in the state legislature of Tennessee in 1796. He later served in the state senate. He introduced a bill in the legislature in 18 and 19 to enlarge the town of Greenville. He built a wonderful stone house out on White House Road, which still stands. It was a 3-story stone house, and he was quite a large landowner and slave owner. He operated a distillery as well as a grist mill and a sawmill, and he was quite an entrepreneur for his day. But that was our first connection with Greenville, which was the forerunner of Tusculum College, having John Guest on its board of trustees. I spent 2 years in college at Tusculum, 1941 and 42, and of course those were the war years, and lots of us had to sign for the draft, and I went to Fort Oglethorpe in 1943, and because of very bad feet I was rejected, and I felt awfully bad because so many of my good friends, John Dobson and Buddy Lane, were in the same group and they were taken. But anyway, I came back home. My brother Jim died in 42, so I was quite a comfort to my parents, and staying here after that. And in 43 I transferred to the University of Tennessee and majored in history and minored in political science, receiving an A.B. degree in 1945 and a master's degree in 1947. I had a great many classes under Dr. Ruth Stevens, and she was the one who suggested the title for my master's thesis and directed the writing of it, and the title of it was The Legal Bases of the Nuremberg Trial of the German War Criminals. I finished, as I say, my master's in 47. I got my degree on one Friday, and the next Monday I entered Greenville High School as a teacher. I had never had an hour of education in my life, that is, education courses, but anyway, I plunged into teaching, and for 38 years I held the fort at Greenville High in the fields of I started teaching American history, and then I taught European history, I taught civics, I taught sociology, problems of American democracy, freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior English, and ended up my last 3 years in teaching Spanish. So I had quite a checkered career as far as teaching was concerned, and I retired in the spring of 1961, after, as I said, having done 38 years of teaching. I started work on a history of Greenville back in the 50s because the town has always intrigued me. It's quite different from our surrounding towns, and I attribute this to the fact that we've had a college here as early as 1794, and the influence of Greenville College and later Tusculum, it's just been profound on our whole area. Samuel Doak, of course, founded Tusculum Academy. Hezekiah Balch founded Greenville College, 1794. Balch and Doak were both graduates of Princeton, when it was called at the time the College of New Jersey. The second president of Greenville College was Dr. Charles Coffin, who came here from Newburyport, Massachusetts, and was a graduate of Harvard. When the Scotch-Irish people settled the area as early as the 1770s, they brought with them a love of learning. They brought with them a love of God. And I think it's these two things that have possibly made Greenville the community that it is today. The people who settled here were quite well educated. They wanted schools for their children. They wanted their children to learn to read the Bible and study it, and they were God-fearing people, and as a result, they set a style of life in Greenville which is still followed by the old families today. Our town has changed a great deal from the fact that we've had an influx of industry, but still the flavor of the town is more or less delineated by the people who've always lived here, and I hope it always will be. I started work on my history of Greenville in the 50s, and finally, in 1974, I completed. It was about 20 years in doing, and the reason why it took me so long was because I had a very difficult time in finding primary sources. I wanted as many early newspapers and diary accounts and letters and things of that sort as I possibly could find, and since it was the initial work on the history of our town, I had to really dig in people's attics and trunks and things of that sort to find a great many primary sources. The book was finished, as I said, in 1974. It was published the next year and came out in May of 1975. It's entitled Greenville 100-Year Portrait, 1775-1875. It begins with the purchase of land by Jacob Brown from the Cherokees, which embraced major portions of both Washington and Greene counties, and it ends with the death and funeral of President Andrew Johnson, who of course was our first citizen, since he was the only one who's ever been president of these United States. But the different chapters in it concern the founding of the town, the influence of various and sundry people. Anthony Moore, the very first settler of Greene County, who came here as early as, I believe, 1778, if I'm not mistaken. He was one of the first founders of Mount Bethel Presbyterian Church. He was on the first board of elders along with Major Temple and Joseph Hardin. He was quite a power with which to be reckoned. When the church split between the Doak and the Balch factions, Moore sided with the Doak faction and is buried in Mount Bethel Cemetery here in Greenville. The book also goes into the influence of the Quakers in our area and the publication of the Genius of Universal Emancipation, which was published here from 1822 to 1824 by Benjamin Lundy, a Quaker. Later he moved on to Baltimore and continued his paper there. And the famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison said that it was Lundy who influenced him in his efforts to rid our country of slavery. So it's interesting that in the pro-slave South, the emancipation movement really started. Also, there's a good deal in the book about two influential Greenville families, the Dixons and the Severes. William Dixon was our first postmaster who came here from County Antrim, as did my great-great-grandfather, Robert Maloney. He took up permanent residence in Greenville in 1796, and in 1797 he was appointed postmaster of our town, even though he was not a citizen. His naturalization came the next year. He was quite a builder. He built a 3-story home for himself on the spot where the Capitol Theater stands. He built a beautiful home across the street, a 2-story brick for his brother John Dixon, which was so fine it was called the Mansion. But the crowning glories of his labor was the building of the mansion for his only child, Catherine Dixon, who was born in 1802, was educated at the Moravian Academy in Salem, North Carolina. Came back home after attending a finishing school in Philadelphia, which was quite something for a girl on the American frontier in those early days. Dixon started her home in 1815. It was finished in 1821. Her marriage took place there 2 years later, 1823, when she was married to Dr. Alexander Williams of Surrey County, North Carolina, whom she had met when she attended school at the Moravian Academy in Salem. The marriage was performed by Dr. Charles Coffin, who at the time was serving as president of Greenville College. 20 years later, Dr. Coffin returned to perform the marriage of her daughter Eliza Williams when she was married to William H. Sneed of Knoxville. Well, this home has seen the passing of the great and the near great in Greenville. Such people as Presidents Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk were entertained there. So was the frontiersman Davy Crockett. The Marquis de Lafayette was entertained there when he made his memorable visit to America in 1824, which was supposed to last for 3 months, and he stayed 18. And he visited every Masonic lodge in these United States. He was a great Mason. Of course, he visited Lodge number 3 here in Greeneville, which is the oldest in Tennessee, and which has the distinction of being the only lodge in these United States to have had 2 former presidents as members, Andrew Jackson and Andrew Johnson. In the 1820s and 30s, such people as Henry Clay, Madame Octavia Levere, Madam or Mrs. Frances Hodgson Burnett, who wrote The Secret Garden, Little Lord Fauntleroy, were all entertained in Greeneville. And during the Civil War, Mrs. Williams had 1 son in the Union Army, Joseph Williams, and 2 in the Confederate Army, Thomas Fanner Williams and William Dixon Williams. And so whenever Greeneville was occupied, and the story goes, I really can't prove this, but I have been told that Greeneville changed hands about 40 times during the Civil War. But whenever the officers were here, they always stayed at the Williams Mansion because it was the largest and finest house in the town and was considered the showplace of East Tennessee. It was constructed through the efforts of 2 Irish craftsmen who were brought here by William Dixon, Thomas Battersby and John Hoy. And the house, which is in the process of restoration when completed, will be the showplace of East Tennessee again. 3-story circular staircase is really a tour de force of the builder's art, and when it is completely restored, it will really be something to see. The mansion, after the war, passed out of the hands of the Williams family, who lost their wealth as a result of the Civil War and their slaves and so forth. It became the Edwards Academy and remained such for 5 years, from 1875 to 80. And then it became the Greeneville Academy, which was operated by a group of local businessmen, including my grandfather, John Harrison Doughty, who were the stockholders and directors of it. And then in 1890, the property was sold, and bear in mind that it encompassed the whole city block, bounded by Main Church, Irish and Depot Streets. The house faced Main Street and had almost an entire city block for the formal gardens for that house. On the upper corner of Main and Depot were 2 frame hotels, the Mason House and the Vance House, which during the Civil War became known as the Lane House. Other than that, and the Episcopal Church, there was nothing else on the block but the Williams Mansion with its beautiful gardens. But in 1890, the property was divided and sold. All the Depot Street property, the Main Street property was sold, the Church Street property, and only the house and a small bit of land on Irish Street remained as a part of the magnificent Dixon Williams Mansion. The house which was entered from Main Street had to be entered from Irish Street, and of course these things will be changed when it's completely restored, and we're very hopeful that that restoration will be completed this year. Well, the book had a lot about the Dixons and also the Severes. Valentine Severe, who was the nephew of Governor John Severe, and he held public office in Greene County from 1802 until his death in 1854. He had one of the longest tenures of office of any other person that has ever lived in our town, serving as either circuit court clerk or county clerk in that period. He was also quite a philanthropist. When Greeneville College moved from College Farm in 1841 to College Hill, it was Valentine Severe who gave the land for it. When Mount Bethel Church moved from the site of the present federal courthouse to where Mount Bethel Cemetery is, it was Valentine Severe who gave that land. So he was quite a philanthropist, and he had a large amount of land. And if I'm not mistaken, all of his land extended out to Mount Bethel. And then I think the Robinson land took up and then went out towards the river. Isn't that correct? Well, as I say, there's a lot in the book about the Severes and the Dixons and other families. And of course, in 1826, Andrew Johnson came to town as a runaway apprentice from a tailor in Raleigh, North Carolina, by the name of Selby, bringing his mother and his stepfather, Turner Doughty. The name's exactly the same as mine, except it has an extra ER in it. and all their possessions in a little cart led by a blind pony. Johnson must have been one of the most remarkable persons to ever live, and one of the most remarkable in American history, because even though he had no formal schooling, he wanted to learn. He had a perfect passion for learning. He paid a man to read to him while he plied his tailor's trade. He was elected alderman of Greeneville in 1829, and he did such a good job that in the 1830s the Board of Aldermen selected him to be the mayor of Greeneville. In those days it was not the people, but the Board of Aldermen that elected or selected the mayor. Then from that position he went on to the State House of Representatives in Nashville, then to the State Senate. He served 10 years in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington from 1842 to 1852, and it was in the time when James K. Polk was president, and his daughter Martha Johnson, who later became Mrs. David Trotter Patterson, visited the White House frequently as the guest of the Polk family, and one of the descendants still has a beautiful set of onyx jewelry that Mrs. Polk presented to Martha Johnson when Johnson was in the U.S. House of Representatives. Well, in 1852, Johnson was gerrymandered out of his district, and the result was he came home, but he didn't take this lying down. He ran for the governorship of Tennessee, and he was elected for 2 terms, serving from 1853 to 1857, and in that 2-year those 2-year terms, he did some remarkable things. He created the Department of Agriculture. He is considered the father of public education in Tennessee. He was responsible for saving the Hermitage, the home of Andrew Jackson, as a state shrine when it was scheduled to be made into a home for veterans, possibly of the War of 1812 and the Mexican War, which was just over in 1848. But anyway, he saved that as a shrine for the people of Tennessee, and I think that that's something that the people of Nashville have never appreciated. Johnson was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1857, and he was a lifelong Democrat. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica at one time had him classed as a Republican, but later in another edition they corrected that, because Johnson was a lifelong Democrat. When the Civil War came along, Johnson took his stand in staying for the Union. In fact, he was the only Southern senator to retain his seat in the U.S. Senate during the war. It's an interesting fact, the way he got out of Greeneville. He was quite a friend of the Reverend John P. Holsinger, who was the pastor of our church, the Greeneville Cumberland Presbyterian, which our family helped to found in 1841. My great-grandmother, in whose home I reside, Emily Maloney Harmon, was a charter member of the church. And Holsinger, who was the second pastor, the first pastor was the Reverend Isaac S. Bonham, who died in 1849, and he was highly thought of. He founded a number of Cumberland Presbyterian churches in the area. He was also on the first board of trustees at Tusculum College in 1842. He's buried in Mount Bethel Cemetery beside his wife, who was a Rankin of the Rankin family, who figured quite prominently in the history of Greeneville and Greene County. Well, Reverend Holsinger and Johnson were great friends, and Holsinger drove Johnson to Cumberland Gap in his own buggy and got him out of Greeneville and out of Tennessee and out of the South, because from Cumberland Gap, Johnson went to Louisville and took a train to Cincinnati and on to Washington and took his place in the U.S. Senate. For his loyalty, President Lincoln rewarded him in 1862 by making him the military governor of Tennessee, and he was placed in charge of the government in Nashville. Now, Tennessee was captured, or rather conquered, by Middle Tennessee was conquered by the Union forces following the battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February and April of 1862. Johnson took up residence in Nashville. It was a very precarious position because, of course, Nashville was a hostile city. General Morgan and General Nathan Bedford Forrest were running roughshod over parts of Tennessee and into Kentucky. But from the time Johnson was appointed military governor until the time he was tapped by Lincoln to be his running mate for vice president in 1864, he remained in Nashville. His wife, Eliza McCardle Johnson, and her youngest son, Andrew Johnson Jr., who was nicknamed Frank, were allowed to pass through Confederate lines and go to Nashville and join her husband. They remained there until Johnson was, let's say, became vice president in 1864. Johnson appeared in a very bad light when he took the oath of inauguration in 1864. He had been very ill with some kind of a stomach ailment, and he took some medication, and on top of that he took some wine or perhaps whiskey, and as a result he fared very badly at his inauguration, and that gave rise to the fact that he was an alcoholic, which of course is totally untrue. But he stayed in that position as vice president just for a short time, because the next month, in April of 1865, Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson was called upon to fill the highest office in our land. He was the only person who was in a position of authority to favor the South over the North and over the radicals in Congress who wanted to crush the South into the dirt even after she had been conquered in the war. Johnson thought that enough blood had been shed, enough grief had, enough tears had been shed, and that the result was he wanted to bind up the wounds, and he had his troubles because even in his own cabinet, with Edmund M. Stanton and with Charles Sumner in the Senate and Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives, the three S's as I call them, was very, very difficult, and of course the result was his impeachment, which came in March of 1868. Impeachment is nothing more than the bringing of charges against a federal official, much as a person is presented with an indictment as if he is accused of a crime. It does not mean that you're guilty, and it does not mean that you're removed from office. It simply is an indictment. Johnson was acquitted with a narrow margin of the one vote of Senator Edmund Ross of Kansas, who was ruined politically because of that vote. But thank goodness there are those few people in our country's history who put their country above their own political fortunes in casting a vote as they did. Well, Johnson continued in the presidency until March of 1869. In his last few months of office, his acquittal came in May of 68, and from that time until March of 69, he still remained in the presidency. The entertainments in the White House were lauded in the newspapers of the day, and Mrs. Martha Johnson Patterson, who acted as First Lady since her mother was an invalid, was credited with giving some brilliant receptions and dinner parties in the White House, and it was the Johnson family who inaugurated the delightful custom of having egg rolling on the White House lawn on Easter Monday, and this is a custom, of course, which is still followed. Johnson came back to Greenville in March of 1869. His home had been literally made a shambles during the war. It was used as a brothel, it was used as barracks, and it had to be completely redone, and it had to be refurnished. Very few of the pieces of furniture in the house today were in the house before the Civil War. But he bought a lot of things when he was in Washington. He bought two Steinway grand pianos, one for his daughter Martha and the other for his daughter Mary. Mary's piano is now in the State Museum in Nashville, and Martha's piano is in the Johnson homestead here in Greenville. He launched himself into politics once more, and in 1875 he was re-elected to the United States Senate, the only ex-president ever to be returned to that body. And he was holding the position of senator when he died on July 31st, 1875. I'm going to have to take a break. Some of them were logged, and I'd say most of them were logged, maybe one or two brick houses, but
this is 1820 you're talking?
No, 1800.
1800, okay.
By 1820, the house the town was pretty solidly brick.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of the log houses had either been taken down, or they had the logs, the people became ashamed of them, and so they covered over with clapboards, and tried to dress them up. But you see, let's say by 1830, you had the Dixon Williams mansion, you had William Dixon's house, you had the John Dixon house, you had the courthouse, which was brick. Now the Presbyterian church was over next to Old Harmony Graveyard, and it was a large frame building with a high pulpit and a slave gallery. And whether it burned or not, I don't know. It's always been very hazy about what happened when Robert J. McKinney gave the land on Main Street in and he, of course, came here. He was born in Ireland, came here and attended Greenville College and married one of the daughters of Dr. Charles Coffin, and then she died, and then he married her younger sister, and they moved to Knoxville. But he gave the land, that's in the deed, for the, I guess it was called Harmony by that time, or maybe Greenville, because the name Mount Bethel had been taken by the other group. But anyway, the church was finished in 1848, so I have an idea it was started probably sometime in 47, and it was brick. And then when the Episcopal Church was built in 1850, it of course is wood, and our church 1860 brick. But I would say I'd say from the time that the settlers came here until 1800, most of the structures were log. I don't believe there were any brick houses at all here before 1800.
The capital state of Franklin was essentially just the courthouse, right?
Just the courthouse, that's right, and it was supposed to be in the intersection of Main and Depot Streets. I don't guess we'll ever know for sure, but that seems to be the best plausible explanation. And several years ago, a well was found when they were doing some excavation there under the street, and I'm convinced that it was the well which was used when the state of Franklin, when Greenville was the capital state of Franklin.
Have you ever heard of an innkeeper named Hughes?
Yes, it was in that play Chucky Jack, but I'd never heard of it otherwise. Now, there was William Dinwiddie, or Dunwoody. You find his name all three ways. He kept a tavern where the Hotel Brumley is. And Carr kept a tavern in his own house, and I think I have the tavern rates in my book of what was charged to spend the night and have for a meal and that sort of thing. He is credited with keeping a tavern, and Dinwiddie. And then through the county court minutes, there are other persons who, sometimes the taverns were called ordinaries, or ordinaries or something, I don't know, some funny way of pronouncing it. But that man Hughes is always fascinating. Now, there was an Alfred Hunter here, a very early settler, and he is supposed to have kept a tavern in the house where Miss Ida Susan lives. In fact, there's some question about the ownership of that house. Was it Valentine Severe, or was it Alfred Hunter? And it definitely is the oldest house in Greenville, 1795, and of course it's long, covered over with clapboard, because, as I say, as the people became more affluent and they became a little bit ashamed of having a log house, that they would cover them over and try to dress them up and make them more presentable to their neighbors, I suppose. But the Brown House, the oldest part of the Brown House, or it's really the Josiah Clawson House, was the original owner. The original part of it was brick, and it dates from 1810. That's pretty early. So the town, I would say, let's say by 1850, I would say that both sides of Main Street were just filled with brick residences, and most of them were right on the sidewalk. I know in the block down here, the Haynes house was right on the sidewalk where the trim home is, and you entered it from stairways that went up both from the Spencer Street side and from the Main Street side. And up and down Main Street, there were brick houses, some large, some small. There was a huge brick house where the Greene County Bank stands next to the Presbyterian Church, and it was used as a store building, first by William Dixon and later by the Brown brothers, William and Joseph R. and John A. Brown. And of course, there was a beautiful brick house with the corbelled ends, like you see in many of the houses in Jonesboro, where Nations Bank is. And there's a picture of it in my book. And at one time, it was used as the post office. But Main Street and the surrounding adjoining streets were just lined with beautiful brick houses, usually two-story. Some of them quite small, and some of them very, very large, as the Dixon houses were, and of course the Dixon store. And it's just a tragedy that our beautiful old courthouse was ever torn down, because it was built in the 1820s, and then it was enlarged, with offices and the cupola, and that, of course, was the building where Andrew Johnson's funeral was conducted in 1875. But it was torn down in 1916, and the President's courthouse was built in. But it would just have been wonderful if that could have been retained. I'm kind of beginning to ramble. What? Don't you want to ask me a question or something? Is on pretty good authority. I couldn't quote the authority, but it seems as if there may be a mention of that in Ramsey's and maybe Haywood's Civil and Political History of Tennessee, which was one of the very earliest books on the state. But it seemed that the Indians would stop at the Big Spring and drink and so forth, and that there is a story of where Azariah Doughty killed an Indian once in the Big Spring. Body floated, I guess, down the creek in the river, I don't know what. But it seems that it was the crossroads of two Indian trails, and it was just sort of a natural spot for the town to be established, particularly. And of course, it was the Big Spring that was the deciding factor for settlers to come here, because an abundant water supply was the first thing that people looked for when they were establishing a new settlement.
There's a series of articles by a Greenville lawyer named A.B. Wilson. You know that name, I'm sure. And he says that the old trail, the Pioneer Road, came up North Main and went through Oak Grove Cemetery, and then I assume on out towards Stamps Ferry Road.
Well, there is a possibility of that, but now the trail or the road going out to Tusculum came up past the Sevier property, because I have heard it said when the Smith house was built, where Dr. E.B. Smith lived on the corner down here of Main and Spencer, that the road went down by the Jones house, which we know as the Armitage house, and the street was squared up before the Smith house was built. And I don't know, but of course the Seviers owned all this property up through here, and it was from the Sevier heirs that that Oak Grove Cemetery was bought in the first grave was placed there in 1880. It was C.J. McInturf, Christopher Jefferson McInturf, who was the great-great-grandfather of Alice Murray. And then the next one was George M. Spencer, but they have 1883 on the posts there. But that was the year that it got a charter from the state of Tennessee to make it a corporation or a non-profit organization or whatever you call it. But anyway, the first graves were placed there in 1880, and that was a part of the Sevier estate, which went all the way. I've heard Ida and Pauline Ripley say that their grandfather bought the land from the Sevier estate where their house was built, and it was built in 1868. And evidently the Seviers must have had a tremendous amount of land going on out to Mount Bethel Church and Cemetery. I'm trying to think, but that name Hughes, aside from that play Chucky Jack, I haven't found it in any research or anything.
Yeah, it was kind of a surprise to me too. I was just curious if you'd heard of it. So you're thinking that maybe the road that goes past the high school today, which was of course the muster ground in those days, was the original road bed?
I think so, and of course I think, originally that street was referred to as Water Street because the Richland Creek overflowed you had to ford the creek in order to get from one side to the other. But then when Greenville College was built up here on College Hill in 1841, that's when the name of the street was changed to College Street. Water Street, but a lot of the old timers still refer to it as Water Street. But you knew there was a grist mill, didn't you? Down at the end of, in fact, there's a picture of it in my book that I got from, it was a picture that Mr. Willie Brown had made, and it was on a glass negative, and I got it from that. And it was a very sizable building, and evidently must have stayed there until well after the time of Andrew Johnson, because it was mentioned, by O.P. Temple in his book Notable Men of Tennessee, and I have the proof. I was questioned about it. Said that Johnson came into Greenville on a Saturday, and I was questioned saying the next day he came up into town, and somebody said he would not go to the post office on Sunday, but yes he did, and I have the proof of that if you'll wait. In my book I mentioned the fact that on a Sabbath, a Sunday morning, Johnson came up into Greenville to visit the post office, and somebody has questioned me, how about the post offices being open on Sunday? That couldn't be. But it was, because as late as 1829, there was a petition sent to Congress asking that mails and post offices be stopped on Sunday. And there's a copy of it. And I got that from Temple's book, and he was exactly right.
Memorial from Tennessee on Sabbath mails.
What about that? You know, the thing about the study of local history that is so great, it's not something that's oval, because every so often something such as this petition turns up that confirms or disproves something that we've always thought to be true. And so it's great, and I'm hopeful that Jan Maddox is right about that book. I may go down there late Saturday and see if I can find it. But she said it was there, and she's been all through those things, and she thought it was at the homestead. You suppose she might have confused that with maybe at Ralph's house?
I suspect she meant the homestead. It's possible that Terrell Field.
Yes, I am.
Okay. Can you describe where you understand it to have been?
The Terrell Field was down off West Main Street, and it used to be, there was a family by the name of Terrell lived there. And it was just a place where people took their cattle to graze or forage or whatever they do, and there were no houses out there. And it used to be for instance, if you wanted to take a walk or maybe a short drive, you'd say, well, I'm going down into the Terrell Field. But my impression, it's the block between West Main and Forest Street, and it continued on down to where we turn off on the Asheville Highway. Now that's my impression.
That large, including the area where Crescent School is.
That's where it started.
Yeah.
And went on out to where you turn off to go up the Asheville Highway. But it was named by a man named Terrell, just like the Buckingham Road was named after Thomas Buckingham, who was an early settler here, early 1783. Did you know that?
No, I knew there was a name for him, but I didn't know about the dates and so forth.
That's a question. I'm getting them rung out. Home is, there was a Confederate cemetery.
Oh, that was my next question. Where's the Confederate cemetery?
Confederate cemetery. It was where Marguerite Daddy's home is, and after the war, the graves were all taken up, and the bodies were moved to Knoxville and interred in the Confederate cemetery in Knoxville. You've been there, haven't you?
I have not, as a matter of fact. I
It's
knew there was
beautifully
one.
maintained. It's a beautiful cemetery, but those graves were all moved. Now, Harry Roberts' contention is, were they all moved? I say perhaps not. And I bet you that if you did some digging out there, some serious digging, you might dig up some bones or maybe pieces of buttons off uniforms or something like that. But anyway, it was on the spot where Margaret Daddy's house is.
Did you
And
get
I believe that possibly Andrew Johnson owned that property.
Probably
Because he owned Signal Hill where he's buried. And they picked that out to be his burial spot, and the chances are that he possibly owned that property. Because when he died in 1875, he was the wealthiest man in Greene.
Well, could that cabin have been
Well,
maybe
it could have
part
been,
of
I
his?
think it's been there for generations, but I have and I've never done any research to find out. I suppose you might check the deeds in the courthouse and find that. One thing that was interesting, I didn't bring it out because it opens up a can of worms, but at one time the Presbyterian Church owned a campground out off the Asheville Highway, up there about where Mrs. W.H. Reeves' house is. And in the I have this in my book, and I left some of it out because I didn't want to stir up something, but I'll tell you all. During the time that it was not used for camping out church members and other groups, it became just a brothel. And it was said that they called the people who frequented it, these whites, they called them Nicolaitanes, and they take their name from Nicholas of Antioch, who was sort of an apostate in the book of Acts or something. But it said that these poor whites were carrying on with Negroes and other poor whites, and even with Indians, and that the place was turned into a regular brothel, and the church sold it. And that is in my book, but I left off the part about Negroes. I just put some dots there. But this is in the Greene County Courthouse. And that's where I found my information. You know, our courthouse has a wealth of information.
It's astounding.
It's a treasure trove.
Well, I'm going to ask you now. Emmett Williams told me, but it was in his later years, so I don't know. He told me that when Morgan was killed, and they took him through town, apparently it was on Irish Street rather than Main, according to Anna Snap, that they took him out to where Gillum had some troops at the Marguerite Betty house, where it is now.
I
And
thought it was after Rogersville Road or something.
well, this, I don't know, but this is what Emmett said, and he said that they brought the body and threw it down on the ground there in front of Gillum, and he said, "Oh my God, they've killed my cousin."
My cousin, yeah, I've always heard that. But I didn't think it was out there.
Well, he may have been mixed up, but I thought since the cemetery was there that he might have had some,
There's some other evidence that it was Terrell Field that they
that
met.
he was on
It
Terrell
could
Field.
have been, because you see, they came up the Warrensburg Road, and they would come right
Come
by
right.
Terrell Field and that place too.
It's probably true that that's where it was, out in there.
Well, you know, there's a letter in Carl Hayes' book from James McGahey, who was the son of Samuel McGahey, who lived on the corner there of Summer.
And he had a store, and you know how he met his death? He was
Fell.
hit by a horse, or fell off a horse or something.
But anyway, this James McGahey letter describes seeing Morgan taken up Irish Street with blood
Well,
flowing.
that would be, and then that could be taken right on down to Terrell Field.
Right.
That makes sense, because the fact that the Union forces came up the Warrensburg Road and the Newport Road, that the highway, Warrensburg into Newport Road, that makes a lot of sense. I let Carl Williams, you know, Knoxville, I let him borrow my copy of Carl Hayes' book, and he never did return it. Brother Against Brother, that was the little
Right.
he wrote. He was started as early as 1806, and the first buildings were constructed, the first for the male branch of the academy in the 1820s, and the female branch was constructed in 1841. Now the male branch they both faced College Street or Water Street, but later the male branch, land was cut off in front of it, and then you had to enter it from Church Street, across from Old Harmony Graveyard. But the male branch had a two-story porch, and in my book there's a wonderful letter from M.S. Royce, who married one of the Broyle sisters, Martha Broyles, and he came to Greenville to be a teacher in the Ray Academy from New England. And he wrote this letter to a friend of his in Boston by the name of Houghton, and describes Greenville in a beautiful way, and tells about the produce, and that he has a real good life here, and evidently he must have liked Greenville, because he married one of the Broyle sisters, Dr. James A. Broyles' daughter, and Temperance Broyles. The Broyles married Broyles there. And he later became a rector. He was ordained into the ministry of the Episcopal Church and became a rector, and the M in his name is for Moses. M.S. Royce, Moses Royce. But anyway, he taught here in the 1840s. In the 1840s also, the two Mitchell sisters, one of them was Mary and the other was Agnes Woods Mitchell, came here with Miss Catherine Melville, and they were all from Scotland, and they operated the female branch of the academy in a beautiful two-story brick building which closes off Depot Street, and the reason that street leading from it goes up there, it's named Academy Street for that reason. And it was in that building that the well-to-do girls of Greenville and the surrounding area received their education. Miss Mitchell died, Agnes Woods Mitchell died in 1844. I have one of her books up here in my bookcase, The Smuggler's Son, and she used the initials A.W.M. because, of course, being a woman, it was better just not to, like George Eliot did, and Mary Ann Murphy, that was George Eliot, wasn't it? I was thinking Charles Edward Craddock. What was her name? She used that Charles Edward Craddock as a pen name. Mary, she was Mary Ann Murphy. George Eliot was Mary Ann Evans, wasn't she? Okay, well anyway, Agnes Woods Mitchell used the initials A.W.M. in writing books, and one of these was called The Smuggler's Son, of which I have a copy. She was so beloved by the people of Greenville that when she died, they erected a beautiful monument to her and put an iron fence around it. And on the monument, which I have the epitaph, it's worn off the tombstone, but I have the epitaph in my book, and it said that her death was considered by the people of Greenville to be a public calamity, but it shows that how beloved she was. Miss Mitchell, Miss Catherine Melville later went on to Washington, and she taught in female academies in Greenville and Jonesboro and also in Washington, and it seems that our country owes a great debt to Scottish women who became noted teachers and immigrated to the United States and taught both boys and girls, the 3 R's and other things too, but this was one of the great exports of Scotland in the period before the Civil War. In the 1850s, the male branch of the academy came under the administration of Reverend Ira Morey, and he also served as pastor of the Presbyterian Church. Now, he moved to Greenville with his family from Massachusetts, and they were Congregationalists, but of course there were no Congregational churches. In fact, I read something one time that I thought was so interesting. It said, Congregationalism is a stream which rises in New England, flows westward, and empties into a sea of Presbyterianism. But the big difference between the Congregational and the Presbyterian churches is government. Every Congregational church is a law unto itself. Of course, the Presbyterian, people think Presbyterian means belief. It doesn't. It means government. Ruled by a session, presbytery, synod, and of course at the top the General Assembly. But there may be churches that are Presbyterian in government that don't have that in their name. But of course the Congregational Church and the Presbyterian churches have a great deal in common. Anyway, Reverend Morey went into the ministry of the Presbyterian Church, and he and his wife operated the female academy here in Greenville for a period of about 3 or 4 years. The male branch of the academy at the same time, well no, I'm sorry, they operated the male and the female branches, but the male branch of the academy about 1854 came under the administration of 2 Cumberland Presbyterians, the Reverend John P. Holsinger, the same one who took Andrew Johnson to Cumberland Gap and the second pastor of our church in Greenville, and my great-grandfather, Dr. William Andrew Harmon, and they are listed in the newspapers of the 1850s, of which there are quite a few in existence in Greenville, the American Presbyterian. I gave my file to special collections at UT because there simply wasn't a library in Greenville or Tustin that could keep the right temperature control in order to keep the newspapers from falling apart. But anyway, there are several ads in those newspapers, and on the wall over here is a letter of 1859 from my great-grandfather to the trustees of Ray Academy asking for an increase in salary. Doesn't that sound modern? But anyway, he continued to, and I have a receipt from George M. Spencer to my great-grandfather, Dr. W. Harmon, for the schooling of Joe Spencer, and evidently during the Civil War period, great-grandfather Harmon maybe taught pupils privately, I don't know, but he did teach under the authority of the Ray Academy for roughly 10 to 15 years, and I would say that because of the war the academy was closed, and he might have taught a few pupils here in this very room for all I know. The academies passed off the scene as a result of the Civil War, and then in the 1870s, I just mentioned Edwards Academy, which was operated by the United Brethren Church for a period of 5 years, and then this Greenville Academy from 1880 to 1890, and then the first public school. Those were all tuition schools. The first public school, of course, was the Greenville School number 1, which is now Roby Fitzgerald Adult Center, but that was begun and finished in 1894. And it at one time consisted of 11 grades. Now when Mother and Daddy went there, the school system only consisted of 11 grades, and I have Mother's diploma hanging up in the wall of my bedroom when she was graduated from the Greenville Public School System. But grades 1 through 12, now kindergartens in those times, if you had a kindergarten, it was private or maybe operated by a church, but it was not a part of the public school system. But the Roby School, and as I say, it was Greenville Public School #1, or isn't that what the plaque says on there on the front? And it wasn't renamed Roby Fitzgerald until many years later, after Miss Roby had spent many, many years there. And it's right interesting, she taught my father, who went to the Roby School in 1894. And my mother, who was graduated there, my brothers Jim and Bill, and my sisters Nancy, Kid, and my cousin Emily who lived with us. And Miss Roby taught every one of us to do the minuet, because that was one of her stocks in trade. And she also taught me spelling. Now, you say she taught you in the 5th grade? But anyway, she taught spelling, and she also came around and taught art. Of course, that was one of the worst subjects that I ever had, was art, because I could hardly draw a line. But she was quite a power to be reckoned with, and was the principal, of course, when I was there. And I guess I finished Roby Fitzgerald about I started in 1931 in the 2nd grade. 32 would be the 3rd, 33 the 4th, 35 5th, 30. I finished there either 36 or 37. I believe it was. It seems as if I went to high school when Kit went off to college at Southern's, because I remember I went down and registered and then went up with them to enter her at Southern's in Bristol. All right.
I want to ask you essentially 2 questions, and they're sort of related, although not intimately. One of them is the term Cumberland and how widespread it was. I mean, did it refer to the whole area? Cumberland Gap, Cumberland Mountains, Cumberland Presbyterian Church?
Cumberland, it took its name from the Cumberland country because the church was founded over in Middle Tennessee, in Dixon County, which is on the banks of the Cumberland. And you see, you have the Cumberland Mountains, you have Cumberland Gap, and you have the Cumberland River. And since it started in that area, that's where it got the name Cumberland Presbyterian.
But this area was never known as part of the Cumberland?
No, it wasn't part of the Cumberland country.
I see. Okay. And the other thing is, I have some notion that your family were builders, the Doughtys, the run the hotel, but didn't they have something to do with the Cumberland Presbyterian Church? Can you sort of sketch for us?
Yeah, I sure will. The way my grandfather Doughty happened to come to Greenville was this. His brother was a major in the Union Army, Major George W. Doughty. And when Morgan was killed in Greenville, my great-uncle George was in Greenville, and the razor was taken off of Morgan's body. It was given to my great-uncle. It's over here in the drawer. And of course, when the mansion's finished, I'll put the razor in Morgan's bedroom. He went back to Loudoun County, where my grandfather was living at that time, and he said, "John, if I were you, I would go to Greenville and marry one of the Harmon sisters." Speaking of my grandmother, Catherine, who was known as Kit, and Maria Julia, who was known as Molly. She later became Mrs. John M. Rabson. So grandfather came to Greenville and met my grandmother, and after the course of time, they were married here in 1872. And at first they lived in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and she was so unhappy that my grandfather said, "Well, I'll take you back to Greenville." And I have something over here in my desk of one of these lightning rod companies which says Bowling Green, Kentucky on it. But they came back to Greenville, and in 1874 he bought the Britton House and enlarged it, and that's the one on up under the underpass where Kyle King is, which is referred to now as the Britton House. He put the tower on it and added a large dining room, and he had about, I don't know how many hundreds of acres of land around it, but it went for 2 or 3 miles up the Ridge Road and down the Baileyton Road, and the land was just eventually sold off, sort of with the gardens. Louise, I bet you remember the gardens when they came all the way to Main Street, and the bridge that went across the depression that you had to cross the bridge to enter the front door and so on. Anyway, grandfather was a great builder. Our church, the Cumberland Presbyterian, was not finished when the war was over. The walls were up and the roof was on, but the steeple hadn't been finished, the cornice and a lot of the interior work, and grandfather took it on himself to finish the church, which he did. Then he built the 3-story, what we call the Doughty block, where Whitson Hickerson is, and that was finished in 1888. And then in 1890, he built the Grand Central Hotel, which we know as the Brumley, and which will soon be known as the General Morgan Inn. He also built a huge brick building on Upper Depot Street to house the East Tennessee Tobacco Factory. And I remember when the building was continuous, what Cutler Street has been cut through it, but the building was continuous, and if you look at one building on one side of the street and the other on the other side, they're just identical. And it used to be that the whole building was one building, and the street, Cutler Street, or Willis Street as it was called at that time, was cut through that building. And grandfather built that, and then he built Uncle George's home for him in 1905, and he built the home for my father and mother in 1907.
Uncle George's home being which one?
The Big Spring Inn.
Uh-huh.
And of course, where Joe and Judy live was the one he built for my father.
You mentioned Hickerson before you talked about the tobacco factory.
Well, Whitson Hickerson, it was Doughty Stevens'
company.
company.
I see.
All Whitson
Okay.
Hickerson. And then he built a home for my Aunt Emily in Cincinnati, and then he willed his home place to the youngest son, Rob, who is George Doughty's father. But it was because of Major George Doughty being in Greeneville that grandfather had to come here in the first place during the war. The Fitzgeralds and the Rumbo families came to Greeneville with the building of the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. Jacob Rumbo was married to Ann Dandridge Sutherland Rumbo, who was a niece of Martha Washington, and the later, of course, were buried in Old Harmony Graveyard. Martha Washington's maiden name was Dandridge, and Ann Dandridge Sutherland Rumbo's mother was Martha Washington's sister. Well, they had a very colorful family, a very large family, several boys and girls, I think about 10 or 12 in number. One of them was Thomas Rumbo, who was killed in the Battle of Morristown in 1864. He's buried in Old Harmony, and there's a picture of him in my book. Lucy Rumbo, who married Joe Williams. They were married in 1861, and I'll talk about her a little bit later. Mrs. Fitzgerald, whose name was Annie. There was one named James Rumbo, who had a family, lived over in a house on Irish Street, and they moved to Hot Springs, North Carolina, either during the war or just after the war. But anyway, it was a very colorful family, and when General Morgan came into Greeneville and was over at the Williams house, Mr. Rumbo, Jacob Rumbo, went over and urged him not to stay in the Williams home. He said you would be better off if you were with your men in the field. And if Morgan had listened to that advice, he would not have been ambushed as he was or killed on the morning of September 4th, 1864. Well, there was a great hue and cry in Greeneville that Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Joe Williams, who seems to have had Union sympathies because her husband was connected with the Union cause. And when Morgan was visiting in Greeneville the month before his death, he was here in August of '64, he found in Mrs. Williams' prayer book over in the Williams mansion a detailed description of how many troops he had and how many pieces of artillery. And so I guess the reason I've always thought that she was the culprit, sent the news to Bull's Gap, I don't think she actually went herself. If she could have betrayed him once, she could have done it a second time. I said, that's the way I feel that way. Mrs. W.H. O'Keefe used to tell the story that when Morgan was shot and his body was taken back into the Williams mansion and dressed for burial and lying in state, that when Mrs. Joe Williams entered the house, when she went in to view the remains of Morgan, that the Confederate honor guard crossed their rifles and said, "No traitor shall pass here." Well, the hue and cry in Greeneville was so great that Joe Williams took his wife to Knoxville. Within Union lines, they stayed at the Franklin House, which is on the spot where the Knox County Courthouse is today. And while here, they met these two dashing Army officers of the Union Army, Captain George W. Roby and Major John Wright. Well, lo and behold, the Army of Occupation came to Greeneville in the summer of 1865, and who would be in this Army of Occupation but Captain Roby and Major Wright? Where did they stay? At the Williams Mansion. And Greeneville must have been a very swinging place in the summer of 1865 because the Union officers were wined and dined. There were railroad picnics up to Johnson's Tank, which we now call Johnson City. There wasn't any town there. It's a Johnny-come-lately. There were receptions and dances and balls. At one time, Mrs. Williams, who was always in the company of Captain Roby, they were seen riding out through the countryside from Greenville. One time they were at this reception, and somebody came in and found Major Roby in a very compromising situation with his hand down Mrs. Williams' dress. And this is in Howard Swiggett's book, The Rebel Raider, if you've ever read it. Well, anyway, the Fitzgeralds, Mr. Fitzgerald and his wife, Annie Rumble Fitzgerald, had 8 children. And one of them they named Lucy in honor of Lucy Williams, who was Mrs. Fitzgerald's sister. And another one they named Roby in honor of Captain George W. Roby. But when the war was over, Captain Roby went away. Major Wright went back to be a hotel clerk, a desk clerk in a hotel in Cincinnati. It was not the glamorous life that they lived while they were in the Union Army. But be that as it may, Joe Williams brought suit against his wife for divorce in the Chancery Court of Greenville, and of course the divorce in those days was just virtually unthinkable, it was unheard of. The divorce was granted. In the divorce proceedings, he charges Mrs. Williams with all kinds of things, with complicity in the death of Morgan, with killing their little boy, that she took it up to bed one night and brought him down dressed for burial the next morning, accusing her of taking a hat pin and sticking in the baby's brain. Anyway, the divorce was granted, and Mrs. Williams left Greenville, and she went away to the west, which at that time was Little Rock, Arkansas, and lo and behold, who went with her but her own brother-in-law, Mr. Fitzgerald. And he left his wife here with 8 small children. Later, Mr. Fitzgerald wrote back and wanted to come back to Greenville, and one of his sons, there were twins in the family, and the twins were known as Pink and Buster. And they were born on the same day, naturally, and they died a day apart. And if you'll look at the Fitzgerald stones in Old Grove Cemetery, you'll see those. There was another sister, Miss Roby and Miss Lucy had a sister named Annie, named after her mother. There was a Walter Fitzgerald, there was a George Fitzgerald, and Mr. Paul Fitzgerald, who lived here later, was either the son or grandson of one of the, I believe perhaps a son. And he always referred to Miss Roby as Aunt Roby, and of course I think she and Miss Lucy left Mr. Paul about everything they had. They had a wonderful album of all the Fitzgeralds and the Rumbo children in it, and I saw a beautiful picture of Lucy in it at one time in a hoop skirt. And the picture in my book looks more like Miss Roby than anybody. But, and it's not very attractive, but evidently she must have had hidden charms. But this picture that I remember in that Fitzgerald album was just, she was a beautiful woman. Very dashing and full of life and vivacious and that sort of thing. Well, she went away to the west. And the boys wrote back and said, no, you left us when we needed you, just stay where you are. So to my knowledge, she never came back to Greene. And Lucy wandered, and must have tired of him, because she wandered on down into Texas, and she met a young man by the name of Rising on the streets of Fort Worth one day. And they stopped and visited, and she asked him to come to see her and gave him an address. And lo and behold, it was the notorious brothel of Jesse Reeves in Fort Worth. And he went there and visited her, and was surprised to find her in that situation, and evidently she must have died 2 or 3 years later. I would love to know if there's any marker to her in Fort Worth, and of course I probably will never be. I've never been to Texas, so I'll go this late day. But anyway, that's where she's supposed to have ended her life. But anyway, this Rising fellow wrote a letter back to Greenville telling that he had seen Lucy Williams, and that she still had all the manners and dignity of someone to the manner born, and that he couldn't understand how she had ended her life in that kind of a situation. But evidently it was just in her blood or something. But quite a few of the Rumbo women have been very, very wild. Mrs. John Scruggs Brown in Knoxville was the niece of Lucy Rumbo Williams. And she had this daughter, Alice Marshall, and Alice Marshall had a daughter, Marshall Mills, and they were all just as wild as bucks, and so it was just sort of in the blood. But anyway, the story of Lucy Williams would make a wonderful novel, a wonderful TV show or something of that sort. I'll never write it, but I hope somebody else will. Maybe Robert Orr will. All right, is that all right? Now let's go to Mrs. Hill. There was a school teacher in Greenville by the name of Mrs. Jenny Hill. And she was evidently divorced or widowed, I don't know which, from her husband. She had this one child, Stella Hill, a beautiful little girl. And Stella died quite young. I believe it was typhoid fever. Could have been scarlet fever, one or the other. And Mrs. Hill buried her in Oak Grove Cemetery. But she was so grief-stricken that she couldn't stand that, so she had the body disinterred and built a little room on her back porch, which was on the corner of Main and Church Streets, where there's a little garden now that is owned by the Andrew Johnson Bank. She kept the child in this casket as long as she lived, and she operated the school. My father went there to school and said that she was a perfectly wonderful teacher, but that the children were scared to death because they knew that the child's body was in that little room off the back porch. The story goes one time that Mrs. Hill, who prayed all of her life to die, fell in her cistern, and she screamed bloody murder till somebody pulled her out, so she wasn't as eager to die as she thought. But anyway, the child's body stayed there as long as Mrs. Hill lived, and I believe that she was living up until about 19 and 18. Anyway, when she died, both Mrs. Hill and her daughter were taken to Knoxville and buried in a cemetery there.